Hi everyone, and welcome to week 4. This week we're touching upon the Near East, or more specifically, Anatolia, the Middle East, and the Caucasus. Of course, our big case this week is the Armenian Genocide, but we put this in the context of a much broader history, going all the way back to the deportation of ancient Hebrews by the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 1st millennium BCE, the sacking of Baghdad by the Mongols in the 13th century AD, and the Circassian Genocide in the late 19th century. Once we get to the Armenian Genocide, we further contextualize this case as part of the entwined genocides against other Ottoman Christians during World War I. We may also briefly consider the legacy of post-World War I population transfers between Turkey and Greece, the mid-20th century Turkish persecution of the Kurds, and finally the contemporary cases associated with the Syrian civil war and ISIS. To start with, the legacy of forced deportations that we associate with the Armenian Genocide has a long history in the Near East. Check out this relief sculpture from the 1st millennium BCE, celebrating the victory of the Neo-Assyrian Empire over the ancient Hebrews. Now, we don't have time to dwell on the historical specifics of this case, although it is worth mentioning that mass deportations of captive nations was a standard policy in the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which has been said to have forcibly relocated nearly 4.5 million people over the course of nearly 3 centuries. Thinking about this ancient context is that it established a historical precedent for a practice that, as we'll see, became pretty regular once again in the early 20th century. Recall, a major theme in this course concerns the ramifications of prior history as a risk factor for genocide. As far as this region is concerned, this track record goes back pretty far. The geography of the region at the crossroads of the Old World, which put it dead center, for example, of the Mongol invasion of the Middle East and Anatolia in the 13th century. Here you see a late medieval painting of the sacking of Baghdad, in which it is conservatively estimated that 90,000 civilians were massacred, although some Arab sources go as far as 2 million. So, not only does this case offer another haunting episode in the long track record of genocide in the region, but it also set in motion the dynamics for the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which originated in the 13th century, after the Mongol invasion of the region was followed by an invasion to Anatolia. The Ottomans were one of many small, semi-independent principalities that emerged from this, although they soon became the dominant power in the region, expanding into the Middle East, North Africa, the Caucasus, the Balkans, and even parts of Eastern Europe. At this point, I want to pause for a moment and step back a bit to take in the larger picture. By now you should have hard copies of these books by Mark Levine. The preface and intro from Volume 1 here reviews his systems-level thesis that I briefly covered last week. His approach helps us see these historical cases of genocide, or subgenocidal violence, not as isolated episodes of systemic crisis. So as we consider the trans-historical connections between, for example, the ancient Assyrians and Mongols on the one hand, and the Armenian Genocide and ISIS on the other hand, we can think about these various cases like a series of distinct yet interwoven chain links, or like a transmission belt. With that said, our readings this week focus on a distinctly modern historical context, starting roughly in the late 19th century to the present. In this context, Levine introduces the notion of the European rimlands, where there was a persistent accumulation and concentration of genocidal violence from roughly 1912 to 1953. He uses a tectonic plate metaphor to identify 3 geopolitical fault zones. First is the Balkans, which will be our focus in week 6, when we look at the Balkan Wars that began in 1912. Next week we'll look at Zone 3 here, which Levine calls the lands between in Central and Eastern Europe. Our focus this week, however, is on Zone 2 of this map, or the fault line between the Caucasus, the Black Sea, and Anatolia. What is significant about all of these zones is that, in the beginning of this historical era, the entire geopolitical region was divvied up by a few large, land-based dynastic empires, including not just the Ottomans, but also the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires. By the end of this period, however, in the mid-20th century, the political geography of the entire region was entirely reorganized as post-imperial, sovereign nation-states. Recall our argument last week about the genocidal implications of the nation-state as a modern political form, and think about how this argument applies to our context this week. But before we get to the rise of the nation-state, we first have to explain the inter-imperial contest that destabilized the region so significantly in the late 19th century. Particularly relevant is the so-called Great Game between the Russian and British empires over hegemony in Central Asia. The strategic aim of the British Russians from taking over Afghanistan as a launching pad for a possible invasion of the Indian subcontinent. Meanwhile, the Russians aimed to consolidate and secure their southern borderlands, especially as they expanded into the Black Sea region and began colonizing the North Caucasus at the expense of the Ottoman and Persian empires. This pictorial map helps us see how this geostrategically vital, narrow strip of land not only served as a natural barrier, but also provided year-round warm water ports, and hence the possibility of trading potentially limitless Ukrainian grain with burgeoning European markets, thereby providing Russia with capital that it so desperately needed in order to industrialize and keep pace with Britain and its other imperial rivals. So the Russians had a long-term strategic interest in securing this territory, which was mostly populated by several tribes of Turkish-speaking Sunni Muslims, including the Dagestanis, the Chechens, and most importantly, as far as Reading 2 is concerned, the presence of these peoples and the potential for resistance generated a certain degree of Russian imperial anxiety that if they did not assert their authority, other powers would, if only to use the region as a potential launching pad from which to strike at the empire's very own heartlands. This is a very important theme this week, as targeted groups are often imagined by the perpetrators to be dangerous fifth columnists who threaten to sabotage their strategic interest at the behest of imperial rivals. So that is what was at stake in the Circassian case. The Russians had begun the process of invading Circassia since the turn of the 19th century, and they were as proxies. After the Russian defeat in the Crimean War in 1856, the Russians eventually decided in the early 1860s to quote-unquote solve this problem by transferring up to 2 million people from the Russian Caucasus to Ottoman Anatolia and the Balkans. Yet even if the agenda was mass deportation, this was largely achieved as part of a larger counterinsurgency strategy involving free fire zones, the razing of entire villages, and reprisal massacres. This was a portend of what was to come in terms of the instrumental use of violence and terror as a means of inducing forced removals. In any case, the fallout of the Circassian expulsion had long-term consequences, particularly in terms of altering the human and political geography of Anatolia. Traditionally, the Ottomans managed this cultural diversity by tolerating the presence of non-Muslims, but the influx of several million Muslim refugees from the Caucasus, including not just the Circassians but others as well, had a significant destabilizing effect. In fact, there's some evidence that some descendants of these deported Circassians, Chechens, and others would play a role in perpetrating the Armenian genocide. Again, we see victims becoming killers. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, as we still need to survey the late 19th century macro-level structural factors, especially as the Ottoman Empire was collapsing in the Balkans, where the era of Romantic nationalism galvanized revolutionary movements and pushes for independence. This combined with a confluence of destabilizing circumstances during the 1870s, such as the 1873 global financial crisis, which worsened a long-term cycle of Ottoman defaults on high-interest loans from European banks. At the same time, the Russians were still agitating Slavic independence movements, just as the British were pressing for internal Ottoman reforms on behalf of Ottoman Christians. This was the situation facing Abdul Hamid II, who became Sultan in 1876 and who sought to assert control through movements across the empire. It was in this context that the Armenians staged a revolt in 1894, leading to a wave of massacres, known as the so-called Ahmadiyyan massacres, which by some estimates resulted in nearly 100,000 dead. This wasn't the only awful portent of what was to come. In week 6, we'll talk more about the Balkan Wars immediately prior to World War I. The key point here is not just that the demise of the Ottoman Empire set off a chain of consequences that would ultimately result in the outbreak of World War I, but that the Ottomans were compelled to accept unfavorable territorial adjustments and forced population transfers. This all dealt a heavy blow to Ottoman pride and had a traumatic impact on the emergent Turkish national consciousness. Recall this point from Underpinnings Week 5, on the social-psychological roles of existential anxiety and humiliation in the etiology of genocide. As we'll see, this helps us understand how the Ottoman as subversive enemies who should quote-unquote never again be allowed to threaten state security. This was the context behind the process of Turkish national identity formation, which was very much driven by this revolutionary movement, known as the Committee of Union and Progress, which originally was relatively progressive and diverse. Only over time did it shift towards a narrower vision of ethnic nationalism. Among other things, it was marked by the importation of the modern nationalist model from the West. And faced with a legacy of humiliation and foreign aggrandizement, it was driven by a perceived need to play catch-up, and an increasing vision of social engineering fits into this content from Week 6 of Underpinnings, especially Zygmunt Bauman's thesis of modern genocide as genocide with a purpose. The CUP desire for an ethnically homogeneous and strategically secured nation-state is emblematic of this larger theme regarding the perpetrator's obsession with manufacturing a sense of purity, as well as this idea about the gardening metaphor, or that modern statecraft is like the forming will of a gardener. In a more general sense, this also recalls the concept of authoritarian high modernism, of which the CUP is a prime example. In any case, the structure for the CUP to implement its strategic vision, as well as to achieve a sense of permanent security by dealing with perceived fifth columnists once and for all. As we'll see, all Ottoman Christians were targeted, but the Armenians in particular were singled out. Why? Well, that largely had to do with military and strategic considerations, particularly as the Russians were interested in exploiting Armenian grievances to their advantage on the Ottomans' eastern front. At the same time, in 1914, Armenian nationalists seized their chance to achieve independence through revolutionary action. The situation came to a head in late 1914, early 1915, when an Ottoman military operation in the Caucasus was thoroughly defeated by the Russians and blamed on the Armenians, who in April 1915 launched a failed insurgent defense against the Ottomans in the eastern Anatolian city of Van. At the same time, in western Anatolia, invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Now, there's a historiographical debate as to whether the outbreak of the First World War gave the CUP a convenient excuse to pursue a preconceived plan, or whether the genocide emerged in response to the specific circumstances of the war. Stated differently, to what extent was the Armenian genocide driven by ideological versus pragmatic aims? This line of inquiry parallels a long-standing debate in Holocaust historiography over the decision-making process behind the implementation of the final solution. On the one hand, American sociologist Vahakan Dadrian posits what we can see as an intentionalism is more assertive in making a functionalist argument. Mark Levine follows the latter in outlining the process of cumulative radicalization, arguing that there was no preordained blueprint for genocide, and that there was no clearly distinct line between forcible expulsion and extermination. Like we saw in Week 1 regarding Native American genocides in the Old Northwest, genocide often emerges as a contingency plan resulting from a series of perceived policy failures. In any case, it's important to understand that the CUP's genocidal vision of social engineering was directed against other Ottoman Christian communities as well, including the Assyrians and the Greeks. Massacres, rapes, plundering, cultural desecrations, and forced deportations were all endemic. But how should we categorize these other events? Was there a singular genocide against all Ottoman Christians? Or should we disaggregate? To what extent was the Armenian fate exceptional compared to these other Christian communities? Finally, our last learning objective pertains to readings 4 and 5, which gives us just a tidbit on the gendered dimensions to the Armenian genocide. This recalls Eliza von Joden-Forgey's concept of life force atrocities, which we covered during Week 1 of Underpinnings. Through this theoretical lens, we can see how violence against women and sexual humiliation were used to intimidate the entire Armenian community, and how such violence became a public spectacle that served to terrorize, intimidate, and dehumanize the targeted populations. Likewise, we must also pay particular attention to the specific experiences of children who were targeted as a distinct category. Particularly noteworthy is this last, as it points to an anthropophagic tactic as part of a larger anthropoemic strategy. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Okay, so I need to wrap up, but these next few slides are all still under construction for the next time I teach this course. You all know how fascinated I am with the hauntology of genocide, so I'm always on the lookout for relevant horror films. I haven't seen this one yet, but if you all have any related suggestions, please do share. Also, next time I want to cover the Syrian Civil War, as it's very noteworthy that some of the places that have been devastated by this contemporary conflict were actually important sites in the Armenian genocide a century earlier. Again, we need to understand the ramifications of the deep historical legacy of mass violence. Finally, there's the ongoing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan that's been in the news recently. Unfortunately, I'm just going to have to skip over this for time consideration. Okay, and that's it. Looking ahead, the analytical essay is due at the end of the semester. So as you analyze your piece of creative work, some specific themes that can be used in the classroom. Additionally, think about the pedagogical risk and rewards at stake. Some of you are dealing with issues of rape and sexual violence, for example. So what sort of challenges are involved with dealing with such heavy subject material? Finally, as far as the case study is concerned, check out the syllabus for the assigned rubric. I'll send out an exam that you all have an idea of what I'm looking for. Anyways, that's it for me. Thanks for listening, and